years, one of history's greatest minds labored not only over the mysteries of nature, but also over the mysteries of time itself. He was a man who reshaped our understanding of motion, gravity, and mathematics. Yet he spent countless hours meticulously calculating the timeline of human history. He believed history followed a divinely ordained structure, one that could be uncovered through careful study of biblical chronology, tracing the genealogies and lifespans recorded in Scripture. By meticulously analyzing these biblical figures and their ages, he arrived at an extraordinary conclusion: the creation of Adam and Eve around 4000 BC. But this was no mere theologian or obscure scholar. This was Isaac Newton, the 17th century giant of physics and mathematics. If one were to accept the biblical timeline as calculated by Isaac Newton, the first humans, Adam and Eve, were created around 4000 BC. That would mean that by the time the first Egyptian dynasties emerged around 3100 BC, civilization had already existed for nearly 1,000 years. Egypt stands as one of the world's oldest civilizations, predating by almost 2,000 years the very writing of the book of Genesis itself. Yet in the book of Genesis, the rulers of Egypt are consistently referred to by a single title, Pharaoh. But was this truly the title they bore in their own time? The term Pharaoh derives from the Egyptian Pera, meaning great house. But in its earliest use, it did not refer to the king himself. It referred to the palace, the institution of royal authority, rather than the individual ruler. For much of Egypt's early and middle history, the sovereign was simply known as King of Upper and Lower Egypt. The title Pharaoh, as we think of it today, would not be applied to Egyptian rulers until around 1497 BC, during the New Kingdom period. And yet, Genesis 12 tells us that Abraham journeyed to Egypt and encountered Pharaoh, an event traditionally dated around 2000 BC. This presents a conundrum. How could Abraham have spoken with a pharaoh when the title itself would not be used for another 5 centuries? The answer lies not in historical error, but in a practice common throughout historiography: the retroactive application of familiar titles to earlier figures. Genesis was written centuries after the events it describes. By the time of its composition, Pharaoh had become the commonly understood title for the rulers of Egypt. The biblical authors, writing for an audience already familiar with this term, applied it retroactively for the sake of clarity. Thus, when Genesis describes Abraham meeting Pharaoh, it is not an anachronism. It is an example of how history is often written, with the language and context of the writer's own time. Long before Christianity spread to the great cities of the Roman Empire, the Apostle Andrew traveled through Asia Minor, preaching the gospel to all who would listen. His journey led him to a small Greek city on the Bosphorus, Byzantium. Andrew didn't merely preach, he planted the seeds of the church. In Byzantium, he appointed Saint Stachys as the city's first bishop, entrusting him with the care of its growing Christian community. For centuries, the bishops of Byzantium led their flock quietly. Unlike Rome, Antioch, or Alexandria, Byzantium remained a provincial city, its Christian community overshadowed by the great centers of the empire. Through waves of persecution, the bishops of Byzantium remained steadfast. Though their city was not yet a seat of power, their faith would not waver. Then everything changed. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine rose to power. Seeking a new imperial capital, he looked beyond Rome and set his sights on Byzantium. In 330 AD, Byzantium was no more. In its place stood Nova Roma, or the New Rome, later known as Constantinople. With imperial wealth and influence flowing into the city, its status in the empire was forever transformed. As the city's fortunes changed, so too did the role of its bishop. Once the leader of a small and overlooked Christian community, the Bishop of Constantinople now presided over the empire's new political heart. 70 years later, in 451 AD, the Fourth Ecumenical Council met in Chalcedon. Here, an important decision was made. The Bishop of Constantinople would now bear a new title, Patriarch. In 381 AD, the First Council of Constantinople had already affirmed that its bishop was second only to the Bishop of Rome. Now his title reflected this reality. Constantinople was no longer just an imperial capital. It was a spiritual one as well. From this point forward, the title Patriarch of Constantinople was inseparable from the office itself, marking the city as a key center of Christian authority. Yet history did not begin in 451 AD. The Church looked back at those who had led Constantinople before, recognizing them as patriarchs as well. And so, the man once known simply as Saint Stachys, Bishop of Byzantium, was now honored as the first Patriarch of Constantinople. The title had come later, but the legacy had always been there. This same principle applies to the authority of the Bishop of Rome. The Council of Constantinople in 381 AD affirmed Rome's universal primacy over all Christian churches. Unlike Constantinople, Rome's authority was not granted. It was assumed, rooted in tradition. Titles often follow authority rather than creating it. Even the New Testament Canon is an example of this. When the apostles wrote their letters, they were not composing what they understood to be the New Testament. They were simply writing to early Christian communities. Only later, as the canon was formalized, were these writings classified under the new title, New Testament. Did the letters suddenly gain authority when the title was applied? Their significance existed long before they were formally named. The same is true for the title Pharaoh in Genesis, for Patriarch in Constantinople, and for Pope in Rome. The word Pope, papas, meaning father, was widely used for bishops in early Christianity, but by the time of Pope Gregory I, it became uniquely associated with the Bishop of Rome, and in 1073 AD, Pope Gregory VII made the title officially exclusive to the Roman pontiff. But did the role of the Pope suddenly emerge in 1073 AD? The answer is no. The authority of the Bishop of Rome had been recognized for centuries. Consider Saint Clement of Rome. He intervened in a dispute among the Corinthians while the Apostle John was still alive. If Rome had no special authority, why appeal to Clement instead of John? The answer is clear. Rome's authority existed long before the title of Pope.